The store owner looked at the man in paint-stained shorts and flip-flops and said, "You can't afford this autographed record." But that signature belonged to Frank Sinatra, and the man trying to buy it was Neil Diamond himself. What happened in the next 5 minutes inside this Los Angeles record store will show you why judging people by their appearance is the biggest mistake you can make. This legendary musician just wanted to buy a piece of music history, but the store owner had no idea he was talking to one of the most successful recording artists of all time. The ending will leave you speechless. Neil Diamond woke up early on a Saturday morning in his Los Angeles home and decided today was the day he would finally paint his living room wall. The legendary musician had been putting it off for weeks, and even though he could easily afford to hire professional painters, Neil Diamond wanted to do this project himself. There was something satisfying about physical work, about creating something with his own hands that had nothing to do with music or fame or the entertainment industry. Neil Diamond changed into old shorts, a faded t-shirt and comfortable flip-flops, then spent 3 hours carefully painting that wall until it looked exactly how he wanted. When Neil Diamond finished painting, he stepped back to admire his work and noticed paint splattered all over his shorts and hands. The legendary musician was covered in white and blue paint streaks, looking nothing like the polished performer millions of fans recognized from concert stages and album covers. Neil Diamond washed his hands, but didn't bother changing clothes. He remembered passing a vintage record store the previous week and had been meaning to stop in and browse their collection. The legendary musician loved discovering rare albums and adding unique pieces to his personal collection at home. Neil Diamond drove his regular sedan to Sunset Records, a small shop in West Hollywood known for carrying rare vinyl and music memorabilia. The legendary musician walked in, wearing those paint-stained shorts, flip-flops, and the old t-shirt, looking like any regular person who just finished a home improvement project. The store was quiet that afternoon, with only 2 other customers browsing through bins of records. Neil Diamond headed straight to the jazz section, running his fingers along album spines and pulling out interesting titles to examine more closely. After 20 minutes of browsing, Neil Diamond noticed a glass display case near the cash register containing special items. The legendary musician walked over to look, and his breath caught in his throat. There, mounted in a beautiful frame behind the glass, was an original Frank Sinatra album from 1955, and it was personally autographed by Frank Sinatra himself. The signature was bold and unmistakable, written in blue ink across the cover. Neil Diamond had always admired Frank Sinatra, considered him one of the greatest vocalists in American music history, and owned many of his albums. But Neil Diamond had never owned anything personally signed by Frank Sinatra. The store owner, a man in his 50s named Robert, was sitting behind the counter reading a magazine. Neil Diamond politely asked if he could see the autographed Frank Sinatra record more closely. Robert looked up from his magazine, saw this man in paint-covered shorts and flip-flops, and his expression immediately shifted to one of dismissal. The store owner reluctantly stood up and walked to the display case but didn't unlock it. Robert told Neil Diamond that this was a very expensive piece, an authentic Frank Sinatra signature on an original pressing, and it cost $15,000. Neil Diamond nodded and said he understood the value, that Frank Sinatra was a legend and authentic signatures were rare. The legendary musician asked again if he could please examine it more closely to verify the signature and check the album's condition. Robert crossed his arms and looked Neil Diamond up and down, taking in the paint-stained shorts, the cheap flip-flops, the casual t-shirt covered in paint splatters. The store owner shook his head and said this item was not for everyone, that it required a serious collector with serious money, and that Neil Diamond probably couldn't afford this autographed record. The legendary musician stood there stunned. Neil Diamond had experienced many things in his 50-plus-year career, but being told he couldn't afford something because of how he was dressed caught him completely off guard. The store owner continued, saying that lookers waste his time, that people come in all day wanting to see expensive items they have no intention of buying, and that Robert had learned to spot who was serious and who wasn't based on appearance. The store owner suggested Neil Diamond browse the regular record bins where albums cost $5 to $10 instead. Neil Diamond felt a mix of amusement and frustration. The legendary musician could have revealed his identity right then, could have told this dismissive store owner exactly who he was talking to, but something made him pause. Neil Diamond decided to see how far this would go. He calmly told Robert that he was very serious about purchasing the autographed Frank Sinatra record, that he had cash available, and that he would appreciate being treated with basic respect, regardless of his clothing. The store owner laughed and said that everyone claims they have money, but people with $15,000 to spend on records don't show up looking like they just finished painting a house. The legendary musician smiled and said that was exactly what he had been doing, painting his house, and that he stopped by the store on impulse because he loved music and collected rare items. Neil Diamond explained that he understood the store owner's skepticism, but judging potential customers based purely on appearance was bad business and frankly insulting. Robert waved his hand dismissively and turned back to his magazine, telling Neil Diamond that if he was really serious, he should go home, clean up, get his money together, and come back looking presentable like a real collector would. Neil Diamond stood there for a moment, considering his options. The legendary musician could walk out and never return, could make a scene and demand respect, or could simply prove this judgmental store owner wrong in the most direct way possible. Neil Diamond chose the third option. He pulled out his wallet and removed his credit card, placing it on the counter in front of Robert. The store owner glanced at the card without really looking at it, and repeated that the Frank Sinatra autographed record cost $15,000 and required serious buyers only. The legendary musician said he heard the price clearly and was ready to purchase the item right now if Robert would simply show it to him first, as any reputable dealer would do for a potential buyer. The store owner sighed heavily, acting like Neil Diamond was the biggest inconvenience of his day. Robert finally unlocked the display case and carefully removed the framed Frank Sinatra record. He held it at an angle so Neil Diamond could see the signature but wouldn't let him touch it. The legendary musician examined it closely and confirmed the signature appeared authentic. The album was in excellent condition and the framing was professional quality. Neil Diamond said he would take it. Robert laughed again and asked if Neil Diamond even understood how much $15,000 was, suggesting maybe he misheard the price. The legendary musician calmly repeated that he wanted to purchase the autographed Frank Sinatra record, and his credit card was right there on the counter, ready to process the payment. The store owner picked up the credit card for the first time and actually looked at the name printed on it. Robert's face went completely white. His hands started shaking. The store owner looked at the card, looked at the paint-covered man standing in front of him, looked back at the card, and his mouth fell open in shock. The name on that credit card was Neil Diamond. Robert suddenly recognized the face behind the paint splatters and casual clothes. This wasn't just some random person off the street. This was Neil Diamond, one of the most successful recording artists in history, a man who had sold over 130 million records worldwide, who had written countless hit songs, who was a literal legend in the music industry. The store owner had just told Neil Diamond that he couldn't afford to buy something, had judged him based on his appearance, had treated him with dismissal and condescension. Robert's face turned from white to bright red as the full weight of his mistake crashed down on him. The store owner started apologizing profusely. Robert stammered that he had no idea, that Neil Diamond looked so different in casual clothes, that he never would have been so rude if he had known who he was talking to. The legendary musician held up his hand and stopped the apologies. Neil Diamond said that was exactly the problem. The store owner was only apologizing because of his name and fame, not because treating any customer that way was wrong, regardless of their identity. The legendary musician explained that every person who walks into this store deserves basic respect and the benefit of the doubt, whether they're a celebrity or someone working minimum wage who saved up to buy one special album. Neil Diamond told Robert that he still wanted to buy the Frank Sinatra autographed record, but this experience had left a bad taste that even Frank Sinatra's signature couldn't completely erase. The legendary musician said he hoped the store owner would learn from this and treat future customers better. Robert nodded vigorously, still red-faced and mortified, and carefully wrapped the framed record while processing Neil Diamond's credit card payment. The transaction went through without any issues, because of course it did. Neil Diamond had more than enough money in his account to buy every item in that entire store 10 times over. As Neil Diamond prepared to leave with his new Frank Sinatra treasure, Robert asked if he could take a photo with him for the store's wall of famous customers. The legendary musician considered saying no, but he wasn't a cruel person, and he could see Robert had genuinely learned something from this humiliating experience. Neil Diamond agreed to one quick photo. The store owner grabbed his camera, and they stood together, the legendary musician still in his paint-covered shorts and flip-flops, holding the $15,000 autographed Frank Sinatra record. Robert thanked him repeatedly and promised that this incident would change how he ran his business going forward. Neil Diamond drove home with the framed record carefully secured in his passenger seat. The legendary musician thought about what had just happened and realized it was a perfect example of a problem that existed everywhere in society. People make snap judgments based on appearance, assume they know someone's worth or status by looking at their clothes or car or neighborhood, and treat others accordingly. The store owner wasn't necessarily a bad person. He had just fallen into a pattern that many people fall into, using superficial markers to decide who deserves respect and who doesn't. Neil Diamond hoped that his $15,000 lesson would stick with Robert and change how he viewed every customer from that day forward. When Neil Diamond got home, he hung the Frank Sinatra autographed record in his music room alongside other treasured pieces from his collection. The legendary musician looked at that signature and thought about Frank Sinatra himself, another performer who came from humble beginnings and understood that fame and wealth don't make someone inherently more valuable than anyone else. Frank Sinatra had his flaws, but he was known for treating regular people with the same respect he showed to presidents and movie stars. That was a quality Neil Diamond had always tried to emulate in his own life and career. The story didn't end there. Neil Diamond mentioned the incident to a friend a few days later, and that friend shared it with a journalist who found it fascinating. The journalist asked if he could write about it, and Neil Diamond agreed as long as the story focused on the lesson rather than humiliating the store owner. The article was published in a Los Angeles entertainment magazine under the headline, "When Neil Diamond Couldn't Afford a Record." The piece went viral, being shared thousands of times across social media platforms and picked up by national news outlets. People responded to the story with overwhelming support for Neil Diamond and his gracious handling of the situation. Readers shared their own experiences of being judged by appearance, from being ignored in high-end stores to being treated poorly at restaurants to being dismissed by potential employers. The legendary musician's story resonated because nearly everyone had experienced something similar at some point. The article sparked conversations about class, respect, and the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of how they look or what you assume about their circumstances. Robert, the store owner, received both criticism and support after the article was published. Some people called him out for his judgmental attitude, while others defended him, saying he made an honest mistake and clearly learned from it. Robert posted a statement on the store's social media, apologizing publicly to Neil Diamond and to any other customers he might have treated poorly over the years. The store owner announced he was implementing new training for himself and any employees about customer service and respect. Robert said the incident with Neil Diamond was embarrassing, but ultimately a gift, because it forced him to confront his own biases and become a better business owner. Interestingly, the publicity actually helped Sunset Records. People started visiting the store specifically because of the Neil Diamond story, wanting to see where this famous incident happened. Business increased significantly, and Robert used some of that increased revenue to start a program offering discounted albums to music students and low-income collectors. The store owner said it was his way of honoring the lesson Neil Diamond taught him, that music should be accessible to everyone and every customer deserves respect, regardless of their bank account. Several months after the incident, Neil Diamond returned to Sunset Records. The legendary musician walked in again, wearing casual clothes, though this time without paint stains, and Robert immediately recognized him. The store owner approached nervously, unsure what to expect. Neil Diamond smiled and said he wanted to check out the new arrival section. Robert personally gave him a tour of recently acquired items, treating Neil Diamond with genuine respect, but not fawning obsequiousness. They talked about music for over an hour, sharing stories about favorite albums and artists they admired. The legendary musician appreciated that Robert had truly changed his approach and was treating him like a fellow music lover rather than just a celebrity with money. Before leaving, Neil Diamond purchased several more albums, including a rare jazz collection and a vintage blues record. Robert rang up the purchase and thanked him sincerely for giving the store a second chance. The legendary musician said everyone deserves second chances, that people can learn and grow if they're willing to acknowledge their mistakes. Neil Diamond added that the Frank Sinatra autographed record was now one of his most prized possessions, not just because of Frank Sinatra's signature, but because of the important reminder it represented about humility and respect. The two men developed an unexpected friendship after that. Neil Diamond would stop by Sunset Records every few months to browse new inventory and chat with Robert about music. The store owner never took advantage of this relationship for publicity, never posted photos without permission, and treated the legendary musician like any other regular customer who happened to love vinyl records. Robert said that Neil Diamond's continued patronage was a privilege he didn't take for granted, and a constant reminder to treat everyone who walked through his door with the same courtesy and attention. What do you think you would have done if you were the store owner and later realized your mistake? Would you have been defensive or genuinely apologetic? Share your thoughts in the comments, because learning from errors is something everyone faces. This store owner in Los Angeles made a snap judgment about Neil Diamond based on paint-stained shorts and flip-flops, assumed the legendary musician couldn't afford an autographed Frank Sinatra record, and learned an expensive lesson about respect and assumptions. The story reminds us that you can never tell someone's worth, success, or character by their appearance. The person in expensive designer clothes might be drowning in debt and living beyond their means, while the person in paint-covered shorts might be Neil Diamond, who just finished a home improvement project. External markers like clothing, cars, and accessories tell you almost nothing about what really matters about a human being. Their kindness, their integrity, their values, their contributions to the world, these things can't be determined by looking at what someone wears or drives. Neil Diamond demonstrated incredible grace in that record store. The legendary musician could have embarrassed Robert publicly, could have demanded special treatment, could have walked out and never returned. Instead, Neil Diamond used the moment to teach a lesson, gave the store owner a chance to learn and improve, and ultimately gave him a second opportunity to prove he had changed. That response shows more about Neil Diamond's character than any of his musical achievements. Success and fame didn't make him entitled or arrogant. The legendary musician remained humble enough to paint his own walls and patient enough to give someone grace after being treated poorly. Think about the last time you made a snap judgment about someone based on their appearance. Maybe you assumed something about their intelligence, their work ethic, their financial situation, or their character based purely on external factors. We all do this to varying degrees because humans are wired to make quick assessments for survival purposes. But in modern society, those snap judgments are usually wrong and often harmful. The person you dismiss might be exactly the person who could teach you something valuable, offer you an opportunity, or become an important friend. Robert's transformation after meeting Neil Diamond shows that people can change when confronted with their mistakes. The store owner didn't make excuses or blame others. He acknowledged his error, apologized sincerely, and took concrete steps to ensure he wouldn't repeat that behavior. That's what real growth looks like. Not perfection, but the willingness to admit when you're wrong and do better going forward. The fact that Neil Diamond rewarded that growth with forgiveness and continued business demonstrates the power of giving people second chances when they've earned them through genuine change. The Frank Sinatra autographed record now hangs in Neil Diamond's home as a $15,000 reminder of an important life lesson. The legendary musician sees it every day and remembers that afternoon in the paint-stained shorts when a store owner assumed he couldn't afford it. That memory keeps Neil Diamond grounded, reminds him to treat everyone with respect, and reinforces his belief that real worth has nothing to do with fame or fortune. Frank Sinatra would probably appreciate the irony that his signature became part of a story about humility and respect for all people. Music fans who visit Sunset Records today often ask Robert about the Neil Diamond incident. The store owner tells the story honestly, not hiding his initial mistake, but emphasizing what he learned from it. Robert explains that Neil Diamond taught him more in 5 minutes than years of running a business had taught him about truly serving customers. The store owner says he's grateful for that embarrassing afternoon because it made him a better person and a better businessman. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come wrapped in humiliation, and the wise person extracts the lesson rather than dwelling on the embarrassment. What would you have done if you were Neil Diamond in that situation? Would you have revealed your identity immediately, walked out without buying anything, or handled it the way he did by proving the store owner wrong and then offering grace? Leave your answer below because these scenarios reveal a lot about our values and character. The legendary musician chose a path that balanced accountability with compassion, that taught a lesson without being cruel, and that left room for redemption and growth. The incident also raises questions about how we train people in customer service and retail. Robert's initial approach of judging customers by appearance is unfortunately common in many businesses. Store employees are sometimes taught to focus attention on people who look wealthy and ignore those who don't meet certain appearance standards. This practice is not only morally wrong, but also financially foolish, as Neil Diamond proved by spending $15,000 while looking like someone who just finished painting. Businesses that want to succeed should train employees to treat every customer with equal respect, not just because it's right, but because you never know who you're really talking to. The story spread through the music industry, and several other famous musicians shared their own experiences of being judged by appearance. One country star talked about being refused service at a fancy restaurant because he was wearing jeans and boots. A hip-hop artist described being followed around a jewelry store as if he were planning to steal something, then purchasing $50,000 worth of items just to prove a point. An acclaimed classical pianist shared how a hotel concierge treated her dismissively until realizing who she was and immediately changing his tune. These stories illustrated that the problem Robert displayed was systemic and widespread, not just one isolated incident. Neil Diamond's gracious response became a model for how celebrities and successful people could use their platform to teach important lessons without being vindictive. The legendary musician didn't name the store initially, didn't try to ruin Robert's business, and even returned to continue supporting the shop after the owner demonstrated genuine change. This approach earned Neil Diamond even more respect from fans and peers who saw it as evidence of true character. Anyone can be kind to people who treat them well. Real character shows in how you treat people who disrespect you, and whether you choose revenge or redemption. Today, that autographed Frank Sinatra record represents multiple layers of meaning for Neil Diamond. It's a piece of music history signed by one of his idols. It's a memory of an uncomfortable but ultimately valuable experience. It's a reminder to never judge people by superficial markers. And it's a symbol of the power of forgiveness and second chances. The legendary musician paid $15,000 for it, but the lessons it taught both him and Robert were worth far more than that financial cost. How does this story change the way you think about treating people you encounter in daily life? What snap judgments do you need to reconsider? Share your perspective in the comments, because these conversations help everyone grow. Neil Diamond walked into a Los Angeles record store in paint-stained shorts and flip-flops, wanting to buy an autographed Frank Sinatra record, and the store owner said he couldn't afford it. That moment of judgment turned into a powerful lesson about respect, humility, and the importance of seeing the value in every person, regardless of how they look. Remember this story the next time you're tempted to judge someone by their appearance. Remember that the person in casual clothes might be Neil Diamond, might be incredibly successful in ways you can't see, or might simply be a human being who deserves your respect whether they have money and fame or not. Remember that treating people well isn't about what you might gain from them. It's about recognizing the inherent dignity in every person. That's the lesson Frank Sinatra's signature taught in a Los Angeles record store. And it's a lesson worth $15,000 and a whole lot more.